All right, we're ready to resume with, I guess I forgot to announce it, this is the fourth session of the 134th meeting. We always counted off the numbers of the meetings, and that's what this is. So we finished the overall overview rating, and now let's turn, as we announced at the beginning, we would, to a discussion about the 5 elements of the application, and at least in a general sense. This isn't a binding, but at least it's a good discussion to have about the relative weight of each of those sections. I recognize when we do this that none of the sections is an island all by itself, that they all relate to, have relationships with the other elements, but I think it'd be worthwhile, and we all think it'd be worthwhile, to talk a minute about the relative weight, because they're not all equal, and see if we are on the same page with respect to that, because a lot of other things fall into line if we are. Do any of you want to start off that discussion? I'll be happy to if nobody else does, but Commissioner Cameron?
Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this particular region and what the important elements are. I mean, I think of our 5 categories, financial is critical, frankly. We really need to make sure that the winner or the strongest applicant, their finances are strong. I mean, it's important to the Commonwealth that this is a project that can withstand any kind of a turn in the economy, and that that revenue and those jobs are protected. So I think that's a huge piece of this, as well as pieces of the economic development. Certainly, how many jobs? Getting back to the legislation, jobs, good-paying jobs, very important. And in this particular region, transportation, traffic management is really, really important for a number of reasons. So when I look at all of the categories, although the overview kind of brings it all in, and certainly elements of site and design are very important, as well as, most of mitigation does not have to do with transportation. So every piece is important, but certainly I look at the financing, the marketing, the jobs, the salaries, protecting. Jobs goes both ways, right? It's not only new jobs, but it's a piece of that is certainly protecting existing jobs. So I look at all of those elements as very important here.
All right, that's a good helpful start. Other thoughts, comments on that?
I echo some of my colleagues' comments. When you posed this question to us, I think where I started to come down, and we've talked about this, we've talked about how the Category 2 applicants all had different issues. The one applicant in Region B had certain challenges around their project. The categories in their consideration, or the criteria in their consideration, are a little bit different, I think, this time around. I look at a lot of the financial pieces as being critical. I look at mitigation, most obviously, as Commissioner Cameron pointed out, mostly related to traffic. So once you know you have the money, once you know you can get to the site, then the things relative to building and site design and the jobs can be realized. So they're somewhat taken in a different order as we may have considered them with respect to the other 2 licensing rounds. That said, when you look at Section 18, which talks about the conditions we need to look at and the findings that we need to have relative to issuing a license, almost half of the conditions are with respect to jobs and business impact. So But again, as I pointed out, a lot of those things aren't realized if you can't get to the location and you can't pay for it.
That's an interesting approach. I don't disagree with anything that either of you said, but I put it I have it in a little bit different order. I put the economic development piece first. That's the benefit, but I look forward to the discussion here. The economic development piece first. That's the benefit of the statute. That's the job creation. That's the revenues. That's the spreading of monies out into the community. That's the purpose for which this statute was created. So that's the benefit. And then I put the mitigation piece next because that's the immediate cost. At what cost do these benefits come? And who bears that cost? And in what proportion? And that includes both the traffic, the problem gaming, the other elements of mitigation that have been so thoughtfully described by Commissioner Cameron. And then once you look at the cost benefit and decide that the scale tips in favor of the benefit, then do you have the financial structure to support this array? Now, you could do it the other way around, but that's just the way it seems to me it's worth thinking about. Do you have the financial wherewithal to do it now and to stay with it in a fluctuating market environment? The extent of which we can't fully predict. All we can do is look at how well the applicants insulate themselves from the vicissitudes of that market. And then finally, the building and site design piece, which is I look at as a beacon for attracting people to a place that will yield the development that one hopes. But though building and site design is obviously near and dear to my heart, I think that it is, and while I do think it's a very important element of this, I think it's not the most important.
Yeah, let me mention a couple of things. Again, it's hard to disagree with any of that, but I think it's important to think of some of these different criteria. I think one way to think about it in terms of benefits and costs, I think it's very useful. I would offer the next or the following thought. There are certain areas that go in each of these criteria where there is a role for an agency in the state or for this own commission, a little bit more active role when it comes to, for example, mitigating certain things.
Right.
Not everything can this commission do, that's clear. But there are agencies, in my view, that have an active role here. There are other areas where that role is less active. And in my view, that's one way to think about what the applicant brings with their proposal. The shorthand of all this is obviously...
I hate to interrupt, but could you expand on that?
Yeah, what do we depend on the applicant to do most? Where do we have, I think problem gambling is a really good example.
What?
Problem gambling is a really
Okay.
good example.
Okay.
We will have regulations that will be as detailed as we need them, where frankly cooperation of the applicant is less of a concern because we have the regulatory framework to do that. Now, comparatively, I'm saying comparatively, there are other areas in terms of, coming up with the financing, for example, where we really depend on the applicant to do it. So from my perspective, they could also be viewed from, from the notion of where is that role more active by the agencies that are here, including this commission, or in this case, the applicant. Did you want to?
I do want to come back to that. That's interesting. I do want to come back to it.
There's, the shorthand in all this has been, we approved gaming, the legislature did, for the revenues and for the jobs. Yes, there's costs, and mitigation is an important piece, but the way we come to this decision is on the heels of an economic downturn, where this becomes a big, the notion of jobs, of good jobs, jobs that don't leave necessarily, is a very important discussion.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on your dichotomy between the applicant and the commission is part of the issue, but there are others that have to participate in problem solving and the collaborative effort to make these things work. I mean, the statute places heavy emphasis on the host community agreement, for example. It places heavy emphasis on surrounding community agreements. And it places heavy emphasis on community support. It places heavy emphasis on a number of intangibles that allow a enterprise that has benefits to survive and actually get implemented, because and it seems to me that the legislature was right to concentrate on those things, and they go into, in some ways, mitigation, but they also go into more intangibles like a spirit of collaboration. So I take your point about some things that we can control and some things that we have to rely on the applicant for. But I think there's a third force there that has to play a role, and we have to consider the role that it will play. And it's not isolated. It's not isolated roles. It's how well the pieces fit together that it seems to me is the critical component of this. And all we can do is predict, but we really do have to predict how well those pieces fit together in order to have something that's sustainable, effective, and can be implemented within a foreseeable period of time. So I wrap all that up into mitigation, but maybe it's broader than mitigation and goes into some other things as well.
I think it's broader. I think there's also a notion that I've been thinking about how all of these factors, there's a lot of competing priorities in Section 18 and right. Overall the statute, right? There's the shorthand as well from relative to maximizing the good while minimizing the not so good. And there's no one applicant is going to maximize each one of those criteria. That's almost a given, but I think it bears mentioning. And I think how they fit all together, whether one has more weight, if you will, and we all know, we're all in agreement that, it's around economic development, revenues, jobs, again, with the notion of who's bearing the costs. But how they all fit together, whether there's, who has the greater likelihood of achieving the goals, as many goals as stated, corroborated, or desired. There's a greater likelihood conversation to be had, in my view. I've often thought of it in terms of risks. It's sometimes not very good to think about worst case scenarios, but it's useful as we make a decision like this. This kind of decision has to endure for at least 17 or 18 years, because we're not just talking about the term of the license, we're talking about a period of construction that's important. And let me just building on that notion of risk, what makes this region different from the decisions that we've made before? This is a higher cost operation. The revenues, the potential revenues to this region are greater than the other regions. All regions were treated the same in terms of minimum capital investment by the legislation. But from what I've learned about the market assessment is that this has the most potential. But with a bigger operation come greater risks, right? And I've always, and I'm going to come back to the original point, who has the greater likelihood of achieving all of the goals, however they fit together or weigh comparatively.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, and ultimately I think it comes down to an assessment of the yield, the comparative risk, but then who has the greater likelihood of being able to achieve one or the other. For example, if there is a greater yield but a greater risk, it may be that the greater yield is beyond anybody's reach. And so it seems to me and maybe we're saying the same thing, it seems to me that's something we ultimately have to take into account. I'm not sure that fits neatly into the mitigation category, but the mitigation category helps us take a look at the issues, at the cost, the things that have to be mitigated, and the things that stand in the way of success in an overall proposal. And yet we have to take a look at what the proposal promises.
I want to bring up another way of another thought.
There what?
I want to bring up another thought relative to this notion of the different criteria or the different sections. If we're still
Yes.
that,
We haven't. I don't think we've reached a consensus, and this is
right.
a good conversation to create a framework.
There are perhaps the way we structure the application, and trust me, I would probably do it a little differently if we were doing it right now. The questions, we're not. But if we were framing the questions, I would probably, and this is of course a little academic, but the way these questions were put together and the sections were, again, also grouped together, it occurs to me that certain sections, namely, several of the questions that fall under the economic development section, is a section that lends itself to a lot of what they promise to do. The applicant promises as a plan, as a projection, as a vision, has intentions. There's, however, other questions grouped in other sections where that is corroborated, triangulated, where we can corroborate whether what they make sense, what they plan here, what they promise here, whether they can do it over there. Because when we start triangulating and start painting a picture. And I think that's important to think about in the role that we have, not to take one answer, and I know we don't intend to do this, but one answer in isolation to say, well, they promised to do this over here. I think a fundamental role of our evaluation is where else can they Have they demonstrated it?
Yeah.
What other confirming evidence do we have? And by the way, that's not limited to their application, obviously. Their track record is very important. What they do elsewhere is very important. What other pieces of data we can glean from, I don't know, all the finance information that's available publicly that can tell us, their financial position, for example. So there is a role for us to think about each one of these sections, and I know we're not thinking about them in isolation, but where else, from what they tell us, where else do we find confirming evidence that gives us a comfort level that they will be able to deliver on the promises that they have made?
Can't that also be said for things they don't tell us and don't promise?
Sure.
So that can work both ways, that way of looking at this.
Yeah, and what you've just talked about goes into the risk, part of the risk.
Right.
How, you can be promised the moon, what's the risk that you're not going to get it? And the risk that you're not going to get it, in part, you can't just put labels on all these things. In part, it deals with the finances. In part, it deals with other kinds of things. And so I think your idea about triangulation is essential, because these pieces of the application don't stand alone. Are we in general agreement? And again, I don't want to create little boxes that we consider in isolation, but just for purposes of organizing a discussion, perhaps. Are we in agreement that economic development is the primary is entitled to the greatest weight?
Which includes revenues to the state in the form of tax on gaming revenues, I would take it, not just jobs.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
Jobs and revenues.
Jobs and revenues. That's what this was designed to do. Yield revenues to the state and yield and create jobs and bring people in here.
Yes.
And then that the mitigation piece is the next is the cost piece that we ought to consider. Doesn't make any difference, I guess, whether we consider finance next or mitigation next, but the mitigation piece really is logically the cost of getting those benefits.
Well, I was thinking of finance as part of the revenues piece, but it's
broader than that, finance though.
right.
And then the other.
Are you suggesting that we just talked about economic development related to jobs, related to revenue, talking about mitigation, there's a financial piece to that. All of a sudden you're beginning to segment out pieces of finance as it relates to the weight of these other criteria.
No. Well, I was hoping that we were not doing this.
Not doing what?
Not boxing it out as in your own words. Are you ranking them at this point?
No, I'm just trying to get consensus over the relative weight of these pieces. And if that's what you fear I'm doing and you don't want to do it, let's talk about it.
Yeah, no, I think the ability of somebody to generate revenues, just to keep on depends on how they structure, the deal, for example, and how they propose to fund it. So there's a lot of finance elements that come into the ability to generate revenues.
There's no question about that.
Right.
No question about that. Well, let's start then, if we want to get into a discussion of substance. Let's start with economic development. Shall we? Is everybody prepared to do that? Mm-hmm. And take a good look at the economic development information that we have, and then we can talk about the finances, Commissioner. Do you want to start us off, Commissioner STEBBINS?
Quickly to recap, we broke down economic development into three criterion. job creation, business impact in tourism. And obviously, the jobs, the quality of those jobs, the related HR practices relative to the creation of those jobs are critical. Business development, looking at, again, these facilities and the applicants having a positive impact on the surrounding businesses, whether they be tourist-related or operational-related. And again, then the tourism impact, which is somewhat also gets to potentially recapturing and drawing new dollars into the common.
Can I mention something? But I thought I thought I understood that the notion about economic development included more pieces than the sections in economic development.
Yes, and
Here.
so we're just beginning the discussion. We're not ending the discussion. Well, I had questions about a number of the issues that we talked about. Then we looked at the number of jobs, and you presented a thoughtful discussion of the number of jobs, and the construction jobs proposed by for example, Mohegan Sun were about 1,600, and by Wynn about 1,750. But the salary differences for those jobs was dramatic, 117,000 against 74,000. What do we know about that? What do we know about that difference and how reliable that difference is?
Again, when we walk through these, figures, I think one of the things we realized from the Category 2 applications is we created a spreadsheet for each applicant to complete. So this information comes to us from them. It is in kind of, as Commissioner Zuniga talked about, trying to triangulate information, but this was information that was provided to us by each applicant. I think we saw in the question of whether there was material inconsistencies, questions were not raised about this information as they presented it to us.
And is there a way to triangulate that? This is a recurring question, I guess, that I'm going to have, and that is, it goes back to Commissioner Zuniga, your triangulation point. How do we have confidence in the numbers that we're getting in a variety of different categories? This is one of those categories, but there are many others, and how do we have reliance that these are realistic numbers?
Well, one area that I thought about in terms of construction, there's two data points that I will speak to. Their budget, their capital investment is very different. Their hard costs, and I could point us to the chart that I have, but the hard costs for construction are 2.5 times more when it comes to one applicant as opposed to the other. So if you believe like me, and I've spent a lot of time in my previous 2 jobs ago thinking about how to measure the benefit in terms of jobs with the program that the state had relative to their schools, a very straightforward way to think about it is there is direct spending in terms of construction, and we can get into a lot of whether a good discussion as to whether generally 40% of hard costs that go into construction is material costs, or another 40 represents labor, and the other 20 is usually split between overhead and profit, and some other indirect or equipment costs. So if you assume that these two proposals are not significantly different, and I don't think they are, relative to how they will use and break material costs and equipment costs and other challenges that they'll have, other costs that they have to spend, overhead, for example. There is, at least in theory, a percentage, call it 40%, that goes to labor that is directly multiplied to the amount of construction cost that they propose. And therefore, that number would be, again, would be held constant. It's multiplied by 40% or some other factor, but similar. And the higher the spend in construction spend, the higher the cost of labor, thus the economic development of construction jobs.
But does the higher spend for construction translate into an annual salary that is greater proportionately than a lower spend? In other words,
Well,
is there a dependency between the total spend and the yearly salary?
Well, how do you mean?
The annual salary. We have a number here that
Yeah.
says
Well-
the Mohegan Sun, and I don't want to do this for every number. I just am
Right.
trying to get a feel for how reliable, how much confidence we have in the numbers that we're getting from both sides
Well-
on a variety of things. We have 1,579 jobs on the Mohegan Sun side at a projected full year equivalent of 74,000.
Yes.
We have 1,765 construction jobs on the wind side at a projected full yearly equivalent of 117,000.
Right.
How do we account for that difference? The 40% you described doesn't necessarily produce that difference.
Well, the 40% would be what to compare to the product of these two numbers, right? Here, yes. If you multiply the number of equivalencies per year times the average per FYE,
Right.
you would get a total number. You would get, and actually,
Right.
when our consultant was here explaining, the product of 1,579 FYEs, and I'm blanking of exactly what FYE means.
Full year equivalent.
Full year equivalence.
That's an annual salary.
That's an annual salary. When you multiply these two, this total product, this total number came to about 300 million? Remind me? But however, the applicant is proposing to spend on construction about 380,000,
Yeah.
380 million.
But I thought this number came from the months of construction divided by, so it is not apples to apples.
Right.
I had this explained to me because I had the same question. Why are the numbers so different? There's a 36-month schedule compared to a 30-month schedule. And if you divide that number by the number of full-time employees, see, because they're working a shorter period of time, see, one group would only work half a year, let's say, that brings the number down. It really isn't apples to apples here on the sheet.
Yeah, I guess I was coming a little bit more top
Is that your
down.
understanding as well, Commissioner?
Well, I just thought that must be the missing link. It's the time.
That's, I
Right.
asked that direct question
Right.
of our consultants.
Right,
Well, this is where the total is useful.
right.
The total spend in construction, if we're still in this, and I guess we are, is 2.5 times more for one applicant than the other.
Right.
That doesn't account for this number, though,
Why would it not?
because this number is based on the number of months these particular employees are scheduled to work. So it's 30 months versus 36 months, and that's the difference in salary, which,
It's the total months times the total workers
correct.
and over the total time. It's all three, isn't it?
So being employed more time,
No, if you're going to spend $1 million in a year, and you're going to spend $1 million in 6 months, the full year equivalent salary, with the same number of workers, the full year equivalent salary is going to be different for the two sets of workers, right?
Right. Well, I guess I am less concerned about the full year equivalency and more about the total.
No, I understand that. I understand that.
If
But-
you're going to spend 2.5 times more than someone else,
But that's a different category, right? That's a
Okay.
different,
Right.
I guess I was thinking of construction jobs, at least for now, as more the total spending. However many people are going to be spending,
But this-
being paid a larger or lesser amount. Here's the thing with this: they're going to be paid what the prevailing wage pays, and the trades have a real role in this, and they're both going to do union jobs. So whether that translates into how the applicants view or quantify their economic benefit, in my view, is great. They probably took a little bit of a different approach.
that's an HLT number.
But, yeah, but what this discussion, and I think it's helpful, is showing, I think, is that the projected annual full-year equivalent salary is not as important as the total spend. Right?
I would be fine with that.
Total jobs, right.
Pardon me? So that number in and of itself is interesting, but is reflective of a number of other things centered on the total spend over total time.
Yeah, I agree.
Right.
That's- Yes. It's,
All right. I also wanted to ask about the reliability of the disparity in salaries, which is equally for operating salaries, which is equally significant. 20 and jobs, 2,538 jobs in full-time equivalent jobs for Mohegan Sun in year one, 3,287 for Wynn in year one. The average cash wage in year one for Mohegan Sun, 26,777. In year five, 28,984. The cash wage for Wynn in year one, 41,418. And in year five, 45,362. Then there's benefits on top of those cash salaries. But there's a wide disparity there. Are we confident that that disparity is an accurate projection of what's likely to happen? There we have a track record, I suppose.
And the financials that they presented on their operating
Right.
projections.
A history.
Well, no, the pro forma cash flow that they have in the finance section as to what the revenues and their expenses are going to be. When I looked at, and I did mention this in my presentation, when we looked at all of those costs across the board between applicants, the labor costs that Mohegan projects are tight, in our opinion, are low overall as a percent of the overall expenses. I believe there's examples for certain positions, mostly those that depend on tips, and the starting salary was low compared to what we've seen elsewhere.
Yes, there's no question that the numbers are much lower on the Mohegan Sun side, and my question was, is the disparity reliable? And I take it you're convinced that it is.
I think so.
Let's look a little bit at the capital, which is right in your wheelhouse, and it's been modified by the changes that came as part of the responses to our conditions. You want to talk about that?
What
In light of
do you
those
mean by capital? capital structure.
The equity and the
Right.
capital structure.
Right.
Because it did change with those.
Yeah, it did. I think there's still a big difference, in my opinion. I think they addressed the concern I had relative to leverage, and that doesn't mean it puts them in equal footing, in my view. I think it's good comparing triangulating, and I think this is a good way to think about it. Not only between the two applicants, but with another applicant like MGM, who has many other operations, has a very similar proposal that we are intimately familiar with. They gave us two options for capital structure, and you might remember their equity was anywhere between those two options was between 35 and 50%. Now, what the applicant has done here, it has improved, but it's taken an equity position of about 5% to somewhere along the lines of 18% of the total project. Having said that, they still have straddling these two positions of a preferred equity and a common equity, which in my view is, well, a little unique. It's a little complex in my view. There's all these other parties that come into play in this capital structure, and that carries with it certain risks, unique as well. But nonetheless, yes, it was improved. I think it's a little bit more comfortable when it comes to leverage.
You commented when you were talking about the response to the condition. You talked about the $50 million in guarantee being being duplicative of the backstopping guarantees that were already in place. Why do you say they're duplicative?
I didn't say they were duplicative. I think it's very similar to what they had already stated in their application. They are now.
But it's another. But you acknowledge it's another 50 million of.
No. I don't.
Another 50 million of in effect backstopping.
Well, I don't know. I think we already had this kind of guarantee. They're now putting a number to it, but when they say we'll backstop everything that goes beyond what we currently envision, Brigade will step in. I think they have quantified what that may mean, and they have thought of it as a blanket 50 million equity guarantee. I don't even know if it's this.
Well, I thought that there were. Let me find my chart here. There were specific areas where Brigade was going to backstop, and there was an amount
Yes.
associated with that backstopping obligation.
Yes.
No, I've got it. And that had to do with the third-party hotel. It had to do with some other things.
Yes.
And so there already was a number assigned to that commitment.
No, there isn't. Because the backstop, because they never told us how much those overruns could be.
How much?
How much those costs overruns might be. They told us simply, we're going to get, somebody else is going to get financing for the third-party hotel, but if they cannot get it, Brigade will backstop it.
Up to
Or
a
if they can
limit
get.
of the amount for which the third party was responsible, right?
That wasn't clear.
Well, I thought our discussions in your presentations made that clear. There was the third-party hotel, there was the capital leases for the FTE, for the, some of the equipment, and a backstopping commitment by Brigade.
Right. It might be
thought I
helpful. It might be helpful if we go to the slide, Melissa, on my presentation, slide 11.
Slide 11 on your presentation?
Mhm. So the applicant, MCHUGH, proposes to lease their furniture, their equipment. It's generally called here FF&E, but it's for the gaming.
Right. Yeah, this is what I was referring to.
Right.
75 million.
75 million is going to be leased.
Right.
I believe they should be able to lease that. But if the costs are greater than that,
Right.
or if they're not able to obtain a lease for all of that amount, I'm not saying any of that amount, but some of that amount, as I understand it, Brigade will provide supplemental financing. They'll provide more money, but that doesn't mean that it's 5 or 10 or 20 million. We don't know. They're the fail-safe, right?
But why isn't I understood the application to be a backstopping of the entire 75 million if necessary, and a backstopping of the third-party hotel financing to the tune of 42 million, actually to the tune of $60 million if necessary.
Well, yeah, it's that if necessary, their first choice
All
is
right.
to go out.
Right, no, I
and
understand that,
lease
I understand that. But my question is, why aren't you considering the supplement to their contained in their response to the condition as another 50 million, this time of preferred equity as general backstopping, bringing the total backstopping commitment to the sum total of the 75 and the 60 and the 50?
They're not backstopping the preferred equity.
It's an equity guarantee.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
So
right.
which is the same as a backstop, right? In effect. So why isn't the total guarantee, the total backstopping, the 75 plus the 60 plus the 50?
Because they might not need it.
Yeah, they might not need it, but you're saying it's duplicative of the 75 and the 60. Maybe I'm
No.
missing something here, but it
No,
seemed to me,
no.
it seemed to me
No,
that
what
they
I was-
added another level
No,
of
yeah.
guarantees to the tune of $50 million, if necessary, to put into the project.
And that's not the way I saw it. The way I saw their response to the condition is we'll have this additional guarantee that, in my view, was already there in all the in the forms that maybe that's what you mean by duplicative. Maybe that's the case, but it's not money that they're committing.
It's money that they're guaranteeing.
On what?
If, on an open-ended commitment, on an open-ended guarantee.
Well, I don't view it as additional equity. I don't view it as the additional equity
Okay.
that I was looking for.
Well, I do. So we disagree on that. Did you want to say something, Commissioner?
Yeah, and it looks like HLT is also recommending to us that we look at it that way. They had viewed all three pieces of the equity as adding strength to the project.
No, I think, I beg to differ. I think the the two pieces that add strength to the project is the 50 and the first 100 million.
Okay. We could perhaps think further about this before we finish, but I read this and look at it very differently from the way you look at it.
Well, here's the thing to also understand about those kinds of guarantees, which get me back to these. They're expensive for the project. The
That's
terms.
a different, that's a different point. I understand that.
Well, how good is a guarantee if it's more expensive than what I could get in the bank, right? So if there's a way to lease all of this equipment with cheaper money, the guarantee is more expensive. There's a real.
No, I get that. I understand that. If it's cheaper to get the money elsewhere,
Right.
then they will go get the money elsewhere. But if it, yeah, I think we've beaten this to death. We disagree on whether that's new money or an addition to their old piece and their old projection or not.
I want to talk again about the new money piece. These substitutes, whatever they have to bring in terms of new equity, substitutes borrowing in other
Right.
somewhere else, whether it's
that's
for the
good,
capital,
right?
which is good,
Right.
right? Now, I still think, which is where I was starting here, the amount that they've raised in terms of leverage here is still not the same as what other applicants have put forward in terms of risk.
No, I understand. It's a different and a less equity-intensive structure than Wynn proposes. I don't disagree with that. I'm just trying to get a handle on whether we can agree on what the elements of the enhancement were and what the value of those enhancements were in the overall presentation. And I think we disagree on the 50 million piece.
Well, the condition was 100 million of common equity that gets paid last, and they put forward something that again straddles into the preferred equity and the common equity.
Right.
And I don't see that as strong as I would have liked.
Okay. Can I come back to economic development and jobs for a minute and ask, we have thought about job creation here, but we have potentially some jobs that might be lost depending on the way we go. Commissioner Stebbins, you looked into that. Do you want to say something about that?
We did. We did an analysis, obviously. The suggestion is, it's not a suggestion. Information is out there that should Wynn be awarded the license, that the racetrack at Suffolk Downs would cease operations. And we, in the memo that we put together, we tried to come up with a firm idea of the people directly, the number of employees directly employed at the track. I'm going to need to find that number in a minute. And we took that number, we matched it up with the total number of FTEs the Mohegan Sun would employ, and found that even when you added those two numbers together, that they were still below the FTE count for Wynn ever. We didn't extend the job impact, again, beyond the permanent employees. We didn't get to people providing services, the people involved in growing hay and a lot of the ancillary activities and businesses associated with the responsibilities of the track. We specifically went to the total number of employees. We even added in our own employees, Gaming Commission employees who were undertaking responsibilities at the track. Let me see if I can find the number for you. that what your question is? That
Yeah,
what you
no,
were
I
trying
wanted
get
to,
at?
I really was trying to find out if we, I know we did, and just trying to get you to talk to us a little bit about the net jobs, and then I was going to ask about whether we've looked at net wages. In other words, have we looked at that piece of this? I know we have looked at that piece of this project. I wanted to know what the results were. Maybe rather than look at the specific numbers, what do we say about the impact of that either wages or from some other standpoint of that potential?
Well, we calculated, we came up with direct employment numbers of 1,133 total. And we came up with an estimate of that labor income is $42 million, close to $43 million.
And there'll be some mitigation of that by the WIN commitment to hiring some, and the obligation of WIN to hire some.
Obligation of WIN and commitment of WIN to give some preferential hiring for the permanent employees, but obviously if the scenario plays out that Suffolk concludes racing at the end of this racing season, then when you look at a 36-month construction period, you have a gap between when WIN will open their doors and the employment opportunities for the folks who are permanently employed at Suffolk now. What do they do for the next?
Yep, and I think we're being, at least personally for me, I look at this as a much bigger industry. I really do. I look at all the other ancillary, several thousand occupational licensees and all of the other folks that, there are 1,400, I know they're not direct employees, but other employees that work at the track in a non-racing capacity. And all of those other ancillary folks that, that work in and around racing, the green space. I personally view this as a bigger operation and one that we should look at from a larger perspective than just the number of full-time employees at the track. So, that this is a bigger piece for me personally when I view these two applicants. So I looked at this memo and I thought there's some value in it, but for me personally, it's a bigger operation and then one we should consider in our overall review.
And how do we consider it there? I mean, this is, the reason we're considering it is that this is a job creation bill and in part, and an economic and a money creation bill. So in terms of job creation, we have to look at, it seems to me, net job creation. Maybe we don't. Maybe we don't, and we can talk about that if somebody wants to. But it strikes me that we have to look at it that way. So how do you, Commissioner, look at that
Well,
overall? I mean, you say it's a much bigger thing. So
well, there's a couple of ways.
how
First
should
of
we
all, if
think
you
about
look at the 1,400 folks that work at the track, and then you look at the difference in jobs, to me, that is, that piece alone doesn't give WIN an advantage. They're hiring that many more, but these would be that many more jobs saved, and they'd be saved for the entire time period without the 3-year gap. The second piece of this is, which I don't think we're valuing anywhere here, is with the additional funds going into the Racehorse Development Fund, we are talking about the potential, and there's been a couple of studies done, and maybe they're done by the industry, so you have to be careful about that, that there's the potential to really grow the industry with, and that has happened in some other jurisdictions, with the additional monies to purses. They have had a greater interest in that particular racetrack, and the numbers around employment do grow. the breeding numbers have the potential to grow, the simulcast numbers have the potential to grow. So there is that potential that I don't think we looked at here as well.
We did talk about the potential. I think it was tough for anybody to estimate what the impact of those funds going into the, we do address it, but I think you're right on point. It's tough to analyze the potential impact on the thoroughbred racing from the diversion of those funds.
Yeah, and one way to possibly
Creation
do
of
it would be to compare it to what's happened in other jurisdictions, right? And if you use similar amounts of purses increased, you know, there's one way to quantify it that way. So like I say, for me personally, I think it's an important piece to consider. It's not any kind of, it's a factor in considering these two applicants. And I know that we hadn't talked about the bigger piece, other than just the jobs. It is saving an industry, and maybe that's too strong. We're talking about preserving jobs, preserving an existing industry, and I think that's worth some weight in this discussion, and the potential to have this be a bigger operation is there. So it's a factor.
So how should we get our hands around that? I mean, some would say, and some have said, that if you replace some jobs with better jobs, then ultimately everybody benefits. And better jobs can be defined in a whole variety of ways. One, by better wages, better working conditions. Other way to look at it is the quality of life that's attendant on the existing jobs and the service it brings to those jobs bring to a sector of the economy that is in need of sustaining. I'm not looking for a silver bullet here, but I mean, how do we approach that kind of a component of this task?
No, the prospect of starting with a decision and on deciding on something and losing jobs is really difficult. I would argue that the lifeline that could have been extended to the industry was extended in the form of the Horse Race Development Fund. I know that practically there needs to be an operating track for you to be able to, use the increased monies that come to the purses and to the breeding programs, etc. Now, having said that, I have to recall the time that we last talked about racing when we looked at the Category 2
I remember that
applicants.
well.
Right. And as I recall my position there, and I'll invite you to chime in my mind, back there, it was very, a lot easier to think about that incremental benefit because the applicants that got to that point were very close, were very similar in a number of things. The one that really stuck with me was because of the number of slot machines. All three applicants came very close to the total amount of investment, the total amount of revenues, and the total amount of both eligible and ineligible costs. They got there with very different, but that gave me, at least me, a great comfort level that they were very competitive when it came to a lot of those things. So if you strip that away, what was left? And you'll remember the discussion about would it be racing or would it be M3, D3 as an economic development engine and the potential that could bring, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I know ultimately we made the decision on on a couple of other factors, but we ended up discussing a lot about in those terms. Now, in my view here, the lens that we need to think about includes what's the cost, right? What is the other side of those jobs? There is a more than market rent that goes to the operator in order to be able to sustain that operation in the form of a rent, a lease. Anywhere between 35 and give or take 70 or 80 million dollars a year get extracted out of this operation in the form of a rent in order to be able to sustain those jobs. So that's something that we also need, that operation and hence those jobs. So that is value that is that comes out of those revenues that that are not part of the capital investment or the other expenses that can get economic benefit, like wages on all the other number of jobs that the other applicant provides.
That money that's going to pay the rent can't go into wages for the operator's employees. Is that the point you're making?
Well, that's...
No, I'm just trying to understand it, not to challenge.
Yeah, no, that there's the way, and maybe I'm thinking about it too broadly, but you'll remember my chart that even though it appeared a coincidence, each of the three parties involved here get about a third of the revenues that come after paying expenses. Right. Revenues minus expenses, right. What is left to be divided among the three parties in the form of a rent or management fee or an incentive fee or a return on the preferred and common equity, they were almost similar. So a third of the value from this operation essentially goes to support and actually pay back for some of the losses that have been incurred up until now. So that's, again, another factor to consider. Without a doubt, if this decision results in people being laid off the next day, which could very well be the case, it is rather unfortunate. But I think the way to think about it as well is in terms of what are the revenues or incentives that go to preserve those jobs, and on top of what the legislation already carved out, the 9% to the Horse Race Development Fund, comes a third of the value of this operation, the way I see it.
How is that a negative, though?
No, it's just a cost benefit, right? I'm not saying it's a negative. That's the cost. So it's not in a vacuum that these jobs are preserved. If there was more money to reinvest back into the facility, if there was more ability to invest more upfront, that would result in more quality, a bigger quality for which those revenues could pay for. That's part of the trade-off.
Well, ultimately, you're saying if there's more money, I mean, back to the question I raised, if there's more money that's not going to rent, the money that's not going to rent could be used for, say, higher wages for the operating place. It could be used for a lot of other things. But it's revenues it's just general revenues that aren't being spent on the employees. I'm not sure that really answers my concern about the elimination of existing jobs, but I suppose in every choice one makes, that has to be taken into account, and that it is a cost-benefit thing, but it's a cost-benefit in terms of the existing jobs that may be lost as a result of moving in that direction. I'm not sure we disagree on that.
No, I'm not sure we do. You'll remember an argument you made to that effect when we were talking about the Category 2. And you'll remember that you argued for the money that already goes to PERSES and the Horse Race Development Fund could, at least in theory, suffice to preserve an industry. Again, without the important detail that you'd still need a track to be able to do this.
Right.
I might argue that if that was true for the standardbred, that perhaps may be more true for the thoroughbred, which is getting 75% of the Horse Race Development Fund in this case.
No, I hear you, and I did make that argument that time, and I'm not sure I'm arguing as opposed to simply illustrating that the consideration is the same this time.
No doubt.
And it is something that I just don't want to pass over without pausing to think about it. And that is a cost, and it goes into the cost benefit, in my view, and I'm sure yours as well, the cost benefit calculus for moving in one direction as opposed to another.
Right.
I wonder if we could, do you want to say something more about that?
No.
I wonder if we could, I want to talk more about economic development and finance, but I, for a variety of reasons, would like to talk about mitigation for a few minutes. We had informally thought about how long we'd run this session this afternoon, and I would really like to talk about the mitigation piece of this. We said, I think, on a number of occasions that for the WIN applicant, an important element of the mitigation piece was the transportation in and around and through Sullivan Square. The Mohegan Sun applicant has gone through the supplemental draft environmental impact report process, has gotten that filed, has no significant problems that appear at the moment. But the Sullivan Square piece is a remaining significant piece for the WIN applicant. And our conditions had imposed, or not imposed, the conditions we sent out for a response basically looked at a collaborative response to the enormously complex problems at Sullivan Square, through which a significant portion of the traffic has to flow in order to get to the destination. And basically, at a very high level, without getting into the details of what we asked or what we got as a response, the request was, or the conditions set up what was a collaborative process, at least a process in which WIN had a continuing piece, the city of Boston had a continuing piece, others had a continuing piece. And that was reflected in the fact that we took the amounts of payments that WIN had committed to in the best and final offer it made. We said that we wanted them, in addition to those payments, to pay another sum of money that ranged, depending on the total cost of the project, between $10 and $20 million. And we also wanted them to participate in a enforced traffic demand management program that would assess impact costs on a number of automobiles over and above a certain level that was used as a basis for the permitting. The numbers are, at the moment, aren't as important as the concept there. The concept was that WIN had an incentive. We're trying to create an incentive for WIN to reduce vehicle traffic through these impact payments. That there is a statutory criterion that focuses on reduction of impact, reduction of vehicular traffic. We also, because there is no host community agreement, inserted in the surrounding community agreement, We also, there's a very good host community agreement. We also inserted in our conditions a provision for a look-back provision, the way a number of other surrounding community agreements have. And that too required a continuing participation on behalf of the wind applicant. Overall, there was the overall response was, here's a set sum of money, and the calculations are there. We don't like uncertainty. Here is what we are prepared to spend, and here is how it must be spent. And however, after that spend occurs, the traffic mitigation takes place or doesn't take place, that's what we're prepared to contribute. And so there was, in the conditions, a continuing, in our draft conditions, a continuing participation role in their response. Here is a sum of money, and somebody else will ultimately figure out what the solution is. I don't say that necessarily pejoratively, but it's two different approaches to the same problem. There is a commitment, of course, as there has to be, to continue with the mass environmental project assessment reports and comply with the conditions that come out of that. But I wanted to talk for a minute about how comfortable we are with that approach, with the difference in the approach to solving those problems.
So the difference is meaning what we proposed as compared to?
The approach, basically the approach rather than the numbers. Here's the sum of money rather than here is what we had asked them, we suggested. Here is a formula for determining how much you're going to have to pay for the project as it goes forward, both the temporary, really the long-term solution.
Well, I for one, thought the approach that we took, and that's why we offered the condition, made a lot of sense, because it isn't just about a number. It is about a real effort to reduce, vehicles through a very congested area. I mean, that condition was trying to balance the interests of the responsibility of the applicant, as we see it, the concerns of citizens, and many, many citizens, which is a piece of what we do here, is listen to everyone, and certainly the concerns from the city of Boston. So there are a number of competing interests, and I think we certainly made a good faith effort to listen to everyone and put a condition on the table that that mitigated and attempted to even reduce further the vehicle transportation through Sullivan Square. So I just think there's a lot that can be done with mitigation, and as far as incentivizing people to take a different method of travel. And I would have liked to have seen some of that put in place.
Other thoughts? I must say I share those thoughts, and I share those thoughts because we've had now 2 rounds at the MEPA process, really 3 rounds: the draft environmental impact report, the final environmental impact report, and now the supplemental final environmental impact report that's been required. We all know that intersection is a key to the success of this facility. We all know that a number of other entities have weighed in on it. The Metropolitan Area Planning Commission, which is a thoughtful group of disinterested people, has said that there may be no solution to that particular problem. And our effort was to come up with one that contained a strong financial incentive for WIN to resolve and continue to have a stake in resolution of the overall traffic problem. The thought being that if if it set a number of looked at a number of vehicles that went into the permitting process and was used as the basis for issuing permits, and more vehicles than that used the facility routinely, therefore overstressing even the revamped highway system, that Wynn would have a role in trying to reduce those. Wynn took the position in its response that that was penalizing it for success, and there is something to be said for that. On the other hand, this is a dense urban environment. I think we stressed that several times, and at least I did in my presentation. And the notion that you can simply continue to build wider roads and then see what happens is one that has limited utility in that kind of a dense environment where there are a series of overlapping jurisdictions and a number of people and projects and concerns that are reflected in the planning process. So that was my reaction to that, and I welcome other thoughts from other commissioners, but I'm candidly very troubled by that approach. Before we even get to the numbers.
Don't we have, in this case, when it comes to the traffic mitigation on Sullivan Square,
Right.
We are coming at this from on the heels of the city having not participated in the arbitration process.
Right.
So I might argue that we are in a unique position, unlike all the other conditions, where at least Wynn should think of it as what this could have been the result of an arbitration that may not have gone in their favor. So I might argue that if certainty is what they need, and from their response, that appears to be of high value, and if we want to talk about the numbers, we try to figure out if we are comfortable with a number. However, that I know it was calculated in a couple of different ways, and it offered a look back and a range, and maybe that by itself provided a level of discomfort. But if we could structure it in a way like best and final offer would have been put by the city, this is a condition that the applicant would have to accept to have their application complete, in essence. So I know it was put forward to them. It has come back with this, little difference of viewpoints or what you call approach. I might argue maybe this one is one that we simply impose because we are in that capacity.
Why are we in that basket? It seems to me that the larger question here, and we don't need to answer the larger question at the moment, but the larger question here is how realistic, if we simply pick a number and say that's it, and go forward, how realistic is it that they're going to be able to do that? Number one, and secondly, how desirable is it that they do that rather than commit themselves to participation in a sustainable traffic solution, even if the sustainable traffic solution costs more than was estimated. Obviously, they don't want to have a facility in an area that nobody can get to. That doesn't serve anybody and do anybody any good. And so obviously they have some incentive to solve the problem. But I'm troubled by the fact of simply putting money on the table and saying then somebody else figure out how to solve it. And I recognize the intransigence or the unwillingness of the city to come and sit down at the table with them and negotiate these things. But that's not, I don't know who's to blame or if anybody's to blame. It's maybe just a difference in approach. But that does raise a specter, unless there is some commitment to an ongoing participation in this, a question about how likely this is to ever get off the ground.
Well, there are systems in place that would address that, right? The MIPA process, the city permitting process. I share your view as to, you do need the willing participation of multiple parties. I did not read from their response that they were not willing participants in continuing with the permitting and the MIPA and the.
No, they have to do that.
They have to do that.
Right.
Now, but let me just go back to every other surrounding community, regardless of the size and magnitude of the impacts, did come up with a best and final. Both, the ones that went to that negotiated, they didn't get to that point. The ones that came to an arbitration, this was true for a couple over with MGM. Put together their best assessment of a future condition. Now, I recognize Penn entered into a lot of agreements that had a look-back provision, but which we could talk more about that. But I know that from what I hear on their response, they like predictability. I'm just asking the question, why would we not put a number, however that is calculated, the midpoint of a range, the higher end of a range, whatever else, couldn't we come up with a number or a number with many components or a series of numbers that is ultimately put forth much in the same way that a best and final offer from the city would have been advanced, and assuming that the arbitrator or panel of arbitrators might have picked the city.
And what do you do about the necessity for this thing to work of the cooperation of all the permitting authorities, including the city?
Well, I would hope that everybody is objective and does their job and part. I know that they're not off to a great start, but I would imagine that on the merits of the technical solutions, whatever those may be, the short term, the long term, all of that would be a process. There's a process for that already. There's two processes, right?
Well, there's the MIPA process,
Yes.
and then there's the long-term process, which really the city hasn't coalesced around what the long-term solution is, but there are some plans. There is a preferred plan, but there isn't any guarantee that, as I understand it, that the city has coalesced around that preferred plan and is prepared to implement it. So it's a little hard to plan for a solution that hasn't yet fully materialized, unless the planning parties are willing to stay flexible and make some judgments about numbers of automobiles that they're prepared to encourage to use the facility as opposed to some other mode of transportation, it seems to me.
Yeah, and our condition really did emphasize the fact that Wynn and the city have to work together. And that is not the emphasis on the result that came back to us. And
Where do you take that from, Commissioner?
well, I mean, we were looking at traffic counts that would have.
No, I mean about, the emphasis that you talk about not working together.
Well, we had a piece in there about permits by a certain time frame, which would have the two would have had to work together in order to accomplish that, and that was removed. So there are elements that were removed that take out the ability or take out the mandate that they work together. And I guess my concern is that in order for this to work, they do need to work together.
No, I don't disagree. No, what I read when I read the response was there is a permitting process that we will go through. There's two processes. MIPA, we've already. Yes, there's a supplemental piece, but there's more information. I actually look forward to understanding that a little bit. I don't currently. There's a supplemental piece that's ongoing for the short-term solution. There's a permitting process that will have to happen with the city of Boston, and they're prepared to do that. They knew that they had to do that frankly, from the get-go.
Given where we are and the level of the problems that have already been noted there, how optimistic are you that they can get through the MIPA process?
Not 100%, if that answers your question. I cannot help but wonder that there is. I need to put it out there. It's been out there in the media. The city found itself in the unique position of negotiating with two applicants for a surrounding community agreement, and the agreement that was struck first had a reopener provision depending on the other agreement. And that, in my view, may have, incentivized, disincentivized, resulted in some of the approach that you are now talking about and describing as uncollaborative. I agree that the results are this lack of collaboration. But I look at the incentives that may have given the genesis to that lack of collaboration. I don't know where that leaves us, but I at least have an explanation as to what may have contributed to some of that approach.
Yeah, that may be an explanation. I don't know. I think it's always a dangerous business to think about what was on people's minds or why they strategically did what they did. But I don't think it's inappropriate at all to look at results and potential results. And it seems to me that the absence of a willingness to participate in a look-back provision, particularly under these circumstances, here's some money, you fix it. And I don't want to diminish in any way the amount of thought that went into calculating the amount of money that's in that response. I mean, obviously some thought went into that, but that's an approach that is here's the money, and if it works, fine. If it doesn't work, that's what we're prepared to spend, and that is different from this is part of our issue. Traffic reduction is part of our issue. We own this, and we're going to do something about it. And to show that we own it, here's what we're prepared to do, which is what we asked them to do. The number of $20,000 per car was a number that we thought was an appropriate impact fee, but there certainly could be another. But it's the approach that I'm wrestling with, because ultimately there has to be collaboration at some level, and the approach taken in this response does not seem to me to be inviting collaboration. In fact, and we'll get to some of these numbers tomorrow that were in the response, but some of the money that's to go annually to the city is under the response to the conditions to be put in a trust fund that the commission manages, and to which the city has to submit invoices and then receive payments if the commission approves the invoices. I can't think of a bigger invitation to disaster than that. And then, and it just strikes me as evocative of an approach to this mitigation, this difficult mitigation issue that is got a low likelihood of success. I don't know exactly where that leaves us either at the moment, but I did.
Right,
want to
no,
put that out on the
it's hard to disagree with that. Well, were you gonna say something?
I
Keisha?
just
Sorry.
want to, it just makes your point about yield versus risk. And then, you know, what is the risk? Even if the yield is greater, what is the risk? And that's what we're evaluating, right? And that's a piece of this, is what is the likelihood of that succeeding?
Does anybody, what does anybody make of the safeguards that were contained in the legislation for the notion of mitigation? The Community Mitigation Fund was established for, you know, the 6.5% of gross gaming revenues for, among other things, things that are not anticipated. Now, granted, there's a lot of that's anticipated here, but we are the administrators of those funds. The Gaming Policy Advisory Committee provides input for that. So there's a mechanism to disperse those funds, at least conceptually now. We could iron it out later. One would argue there, with the approach that we will take in terms of informing the Gaming Policy Advisory Committee with the research agenda that we're doing, looking at all kinds of impacts, there's an embedded look-back provision in that whole setup, in the fact that what we cannot anticipate with certainty, the legislation gave us the tools to come back and deal with them later on. I mean, this notion was put forth by the applicant in their response. They're making assumptions, in my view, that should all go there. I might disagree with that. There's many other, things that we might not know that might be needed. We haven't even thought about how that fund is going to be distributed by region, by topic, by et cetera. But there is at least a safeguard, in my view, when it comes to mitigation that I think plays a role in this mitigation conversation.
Yes, I'm not sure it was that fund that they were talking about, or the fund that's controlled by the Secretary of Transportation, which we don't have any control over, and is for statewide purposes. But I have to read. I suppose I should. That's what I assumed they were talking about, but I have to read it again to see. And you're right. There are tools there. I'm not sure the Community Mitigation Fund can fairly be spent on this because, as you say, these kinds of things were anticipated. Maybe not the traffic overload. Maybe, and by overload I mean the amount of traffic, given a lot of success, over and above that predicted. It seems to me that to think that we have the tools to solve this problem is really to blink reality. We're one part, and frankly, probably the weakest part of a complex that we can prod and urge to move in certain directions, but that we can't control.
I didn't suggest that we had the tools to solve it.
Yeah.
I suggested there's at least one more tool that could be used in the broader.
Right. Right. No,
I do understand and agree. I do understand and agree. This is a complex problem. Sullivan Square. I have been observing. I read the FEIR, the traffic section. I asked questions, our consultants, about it. I know it's complex. There's, and I know it's a big problem for people right next to them, which is a very important constituency here. I think, however, I don't know how, I mean, I thought the condition was reasonable. You know, it had some variability. Maybe that obviously that caused too much heartburn. But I would go back to the notion that at least this condition is, in my view, was presented in advance, but the applicant should at least think of it as it could have been the result of an arbitration that they might have lost. So it should be thought of as a condition that gets to be imposed on them.
The city you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, that the applicant,
Could have,
you know, could have, the city could have arbitrated with them.
right.
They could have put a condition similar to what we put together. I'd like to think that may have been at least possible, and that at least possibly an arbitrator may have sided with the city best and final offer. So they would be in a position, the applicant, of either accepting it or not having an application that was complete.
Right, but they've said that that condition is one they're not prepared to accept. I mean, we could conjure different scenarios, but we're dealing with the scenario that we have at the moment. So that's what I'm trying to wrestle with, and that's why it seems to me as important to think about collaboration and I own a piece of this problem kind of approach as it does to think about the specific numbers that are on the table to deal with it. Because the I own a piece of this problem issue, well, perhaps not common and is, and certainly not from sort of an eleemosynary standpoint. It's really self-interest, I think, in this environment. That's why that approach is troublesome to me, wholly apart from the numbers that are involved in the solution. I don't know, as I say, I don't know where that leaves us. I don't know how that means that I'm going to come out. I do think, though, that if the commission as a whole is satisfied with that approach, that we have got to come to grips with, in some fashion, the numbers. I'm not satisfied with that approach. I think I've made that clear. Because it does not make any sense, in my view, and we can talk about this too, because I'm only one commissioner. It doesn't make any sense, in my view, to issue a license to either applicant, saying here's a whole new set of conditions that we haven't put out there yet, and we'll give you the license if you agree to those conditions, and then go into another extensive back and forth about conditions. We've been through that. We put out the conditions, asked for their response. We got what they told us their response would be, and it seems to me that it's we take it, we understand that that's what they're prepared to do and move forward. But others of you may differ.
I know I had thought about that too. Is there a way to come back with something else? But maybe then the same thing happens again. So maybe we have the final information and we make the decision based on what we have now.
Any other thoughts?
Well,
I mean, that's I think an important decision.
Well,
And maybe we need a little more time to think about it.
maybe we do. I would like to think that had we done conditions the way we did them in the past, after the selection of the successful applicant, that the likelihood of accepting those conditions, at least by definition, in my view, would be greater.
Well, we didn't do it, and we all agreed not to do it
That's
that
right.
way.
That's
And
right.
These are unusual circumstances caused by an unusual approach to this whole process. And so we are where we are today, and you may be right, because if we'd not done it this way, the conditions, I suspect, that we would have imposed would have been far less detailed, would have had to be far less detailed, as they were with the Category 2 and with the MGM. But we are where we are because of a variety of circumstances,
And where I was going with that, I agree with that. And I think this was the right approach because there were important topics and issues to address on both applicants. I'm not suggesting that for a second that we should have done it otherwise. All I'm suggesting is rather than what you describe as a potential back and forth, it would be the last one. It's take it or leave it.
And how would that be? That would be expressed before the license award was made? Seems to me it has to be. We have to
Okay.
know.
They could. I mean, they already benefited from this discussion. I thought they benefited from the whole evaluation, the first 3 days of last week.
So what if we all collectively agree on that, what's the next step?
My message to them was, at least in my view, this one condition when it came to traffic, because it came on the heels of the city not deciding not to participate. This one condition, we looked at it very closely. We looked at closely as we could relative to a range. There's an active role here for you. This one condition is a take it or leave it. And if they're ready to leave, they might as well tell us, and it might make the decision a lot easier.
The condition is originally framed.
As originally framed.
Right. What do you say to that, Commissioner Cameron?
I think I could think about that a little bit. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. I'd like to think about that before we make a final decision on that. I mean,
I cannot help but wonder,
being fair to both applicants
Right.
and using the
Well,
same ground rules.
which is why I'm distinguishing. It is unique in this regard. The condition that Commissioner McHugh put forward relative to to the redesign, was not very as specific as could have been put forward. I think it would have been very easy for them to comply, and still didn't want to do it. They explained their use of IFES and other things. But the notion that I'm advancing here is when it came to dealing with Sullivan Square, on behalf of the city, this condition that we put forward could have been the result of an arbitration that may have gone against them. So they at least would have to think of it in terms of non-negotiable. Now, I do get though, and maybe this is where we need to get to, whether it's later or tomorrow, that they would rather have the certainty of a number. That's fine. I actually understand from a finance background, they need to understand what their liability is going to be. If it's something that they cannot control or feel they cannot control, it may add too much risk for them, more than what they're willing to do. So either they understand it better, it has less variability, or is the product of a number. Pick a range on the ranges, pick the midpoint or a 75 percentile or the high end. I don't know. We could talk about exactly what that number might be. But if we were crafting the city's BAFO, which I figured we sort of were, and the applicant may have found themselves in a situation where an arbitrator might have sided with the city, that would have been it.
Yeah, that's right, but that wouldn't convey the Iona piece of this, and I'm going to work to fix it piece that we're looking for. You just suggested a minute ago that we think about collaboratively whether that was a take it or leave it offer, or whether we want to make it a take it or leave it offer and give them another chance to look at it.
I'm not sure I follow.
The traffic piece, I thought you said was should be considered a take it or leave it offer. And the question is, if that's the way it should have been considered, and we didn't emphasize that, should we give them another opportunity to look at it and take it or leave it?
I guess that's what I was suggesting.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Right. And Commissioner Cameron says she wants to think about that. Commissioner
I
Stebbins?
will think about that as well. I want to be fair regarding any license condition of it continued back and forth.
Rather than a continued back and forth, or favor a continued back and forth?
I don't necessarily favor the continued back and forth.
Right. I think we've gotten to a point where we have all the information we're going to get, and we're talking now about an approach rather than as much as numbers. And we put numbers in there that we worked very hard on. Well, how should we do this? Shall we, do you want to think overnight about this? Do you want to take a recess for an hour and think about it? Talk to the consultants? Think about it, walk around, come back? I'd like to give them some time if that's the path we're going to take. And I would like to move this process along. But I'll be guided by, there's no artificial deadlines here.
At a minimum, I think we could easily do a recess, and then if we need to come back and adjourn until tomorrow, we could easily do that too.
Take a recess for us to think about whether we want to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Or ask the consultants. I'm curious. I actually thought we were going to talk a little bit about the numbers, how they add up, because that was a little hard for me to follow. I was concentrating on the finance piece during the weekend, and I saw some of our staff working very hard to try to put a slide together. I don't know if that's done or it's better done tomorrow.
Well, we're going to talk about the numbers, but this is it seems to me something that gets beyond the numbers. It gets to the approach, and if this approach is accepted, then the numbers are not something that we need to deal with.
And by approach, you mean this was a non-negotiable
right
condition,
or having, whether it was then, it is
or where it is now.
Yeah, it's become an issue that we want them to consider as take it or leave it.
So our choice now is to take a recess and talk to staff and decide how to proceed, or to think about it overnight and take it up in the morning. Is
Right.
that correct?
Right.
And it's really just the approach and how to move forward with
Right.
the condition.
Right.
And the reason for not waiting would be to give them as much time as possible to consider it.
Right.
Well, then, I would be fine with the 30-minute. It's a critical piece, right, of what we're doing.
Critical piece for us and a critical piece for them.
Yes.
All right, let's take, whatever we do, let's take a 30-minute recess, and then we'll come back and see whether you have any further thoughts, and we do as well. All right, we're back in session now, and when we left for a 30-minute recess to consider whether and how we should approach the concept of a take it or leave it with respect to the condition for when on the traffic issue. So let's talk about whether that is something the Commission wishes to do.
I have a thought on that, Commissioner. In reviewing what we said over the last hour or so, I think it's apparent to me that we're looking at this maybe a little differently. I may interpret something different when it comes to finance and/or traffic. And remembering that part of our process is that we can hear from the applicants if we had questions about their response. And I know, for me personally, I think at this point that would be helpful to listen to the applicants, to each of them with regard to their response. And that may help us clarify exactly what our thoughts are on moving forward here.
Commissioner Stebbins.
Response on this question alone?
No, the response, their particular response to our conditions, one of our options was, in the process, was to hear from them if we thought it was necessary. And at this point, I'm saying it would be beneficial for me to hear from them with regard to their response to our conditions.
Oh, just this transportation.
No, each applicant, we had some issues about how to interpret finance as well.
Yeah, I think that the 50 million equity guarantee questions that Commissioner McHugh had relative to how that dovetails with the backstop on all the other numbers and whether they're duplicative or mutually exclusive is a good question that I would have for Mohegan.
Commissioner Stebbins, are you in favor of that?
I'm okay with that.
I think that'd be a good idea as well. I think that both applicants, I know that both applicants have heard the concerns that we've expressed this afternoon about specific portions of their applications. And before we proceed further, I think that Commissioner Cameron's suggestion that we hear from them directly is an excellent one. So I would propose we give them some time tomorrow morning, think about this, come back in, and we start off the day with the presentation from them, perhaps about 20 minutes. We don't want to go through every aspect of the application. Some of it is numbers, and we understand the numbers, but you've heard our concerns, you've heard our primary areas of concern, and we would welcome some help from you, some insight from you on those specific areas. And we'd welcome an opportunity to ask you questions. So we'll ask for 20 minutes. If we have questions that take you beyond the 20 minutes, so be it. But if we're silent here, which is highly unlikely, we'd look for 20 minutes to allot you 20 minutes to talk to us about the concerns you heard us express. There's a lot at stake here, obviously. I don't need to tell anybody that, and that is by far, I think, at this stage of the day and this stage of the proceedings, the best way to go. So that's what we'll do.
Can I ask
sure.
a question? Would we limit their comments to what's in the conditions, or you expressed more broadly all of the concerns that we've had so far?
No, I think that's...
Is there a way to frame those 20 minutes, which can go by really quickly?
They can, and the concerns, I think, that we understand and I think we've made it clear in the presentations and the back and forth on the presentations with the statements of material error. I think we've got the presentation and the facts basically down. So that's a good point, Commissioner. I think we'd like to limit it to the questions that we had about the responses that we didn't have an opportunity to go back and forth on. And and they've heard, both applicants have heard the concerns that we've had about those responses. That's primarily where the concerns have arisen today, as opposed to differences of weighting and value. So let's limit it to the concerns that have been expressed about the responses to the conditions. Let's set it for 20 minutes with the understanding that if questions by the Commission take it further than 20 minutes, we'll allow the time so that they get a 20-minute shot.
Flip a coin.
Does that make sense?
Sounds good.
Decide on who goes first.
Well, we've gone in alphabetical order up to this point. I'm content to do that. If you have a different approach, Commissioner, I'd be happy to hear that.
I just didn't know maybe I'm overthinking this. Is there any advantage to going? I mean, you're only talking about your own proposal, so maybe there's no
You're talking to about
Yes.
the concerns we've expressed to the conditions you've set forward. We
Yes.
really don't want, and I think
Correct.
it's clear that we don't want your opinion on the other person's proposal. I can anticipate what those would be. We take those into account. We know.
Okay. So there's no advantage.
So there's no advantage, I think, to going forward. All right? So we'll stand then with that lineup of that proposal, that framework in mind. We'll stand in recess now until 9:30 tomorrow morning. We want to start at 9:30 here tomorrow morning. We'll be in recess until then.
Oh, 9 o'clock is the posted.
Oh, I'm sorry. 9 o'clock was the posted time? All right, we'll start at 9, but we may not, all right, we'll start at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. All right, we'll be in recess.